The vaulted amphitheater of the Galactic Academy thrummed with restless energy, its tiered seating filled with students of every imaginable shape, hue, and physiology. From the uppermost balconies, where chittering insectoids clung to their gravity harnesses, down to the central floor, where gelatinous forms rippled quietly in their nutrient pods, all had gathered for the same reason, the most anticipated xenobiology seminar of the season. Conversations overlapped in 100 different tongues, punctuated by clicks, hums, and bursts of telepathic chatter that danced like static across the minds of the sensitive IARI, slipped into her seat near the middle rows, smoothing the folds of her silver-gray robes. Her cerulean skin caught the glimmer of the amphitheater's overhead lumens, while her long iridescent hair shifted in subtle gradients with each movement of her head. Her violet eyes scanned the room with practiced detachment. She had always prided herself on a scholar's discipline, on keeping her emotions carefully bound, unlike so many of her peers who fawned over novelty or rumor. To her, science was sacred, a lens of clarity in a cosmos brimming with chaos. And yet, even she could not deny a peculiar itch of curiosity that tightened in her chest. Today's lecture had been teased for weeks, the syllabus marked with only 2 words, case study. Whispers among the students suggested something unusual, something almost scandalous. As she set her datapad across her lap, the sound of laughter rippled a few rows ahead. Iaria stiffened. Humans. Their brash, unmodulated voices cut through the ambient hum like blades. 3 male students lounged across their chairs, as though they owned the place, trading crude jokes and nudging one another's shoulders. She had studied their species from a distant recent entrance into galactic society, impulsive and young compared to the ancient races that filled the Academy's halls. That they were even admitted here seemed, to her, an indulgence at best, a mistake at worst. The room dimmed abruptly, signaling the arrival of the lecturer. A hush fell over the students as Professor RX emerged from a side corridor, his serpentine body coiling elegantly toward the podium. His scaled hide glimmered in shades of bronze and green, and his forked tongue flicked into the air, tasting the anticipation. "Greetings, students," he rasped, his voice carrying with ease through the hall. "Today we consider a case that has baffled many, even disturbed some. We will examine the reproductive habits of Homo sapiens, the humans of Earth." The name sent a low murmur through the amphitheater. Iaria leaned forward instinctively, stylus poised over her notepad. At last she would have concrete data beyond rumor and speculation. Professor RX tapped a control. A hologram shimmered to life above the podium, resolving into the rotating figure of a human male. Broad shoulders, defined musculature, hair along the jawline features so unlike the slender, graceful males of Azua. Iaria felt an unexpected warmth rise to her cheeks. She forced herself to focus. Most advanced species, the professor continued, operate within defined cycles. Estrus seasons, lunar timings, biochemical triggers. These patterns ensure efficiency of reproduction, stability of societies, predictability of behavior. His yellow eyes narrowed. Humans, however, are different. Their males are fertile always. They possess no mating season. Their reproductive drive is constant. For a heartbeat, the hall remained silent. Then came the wave of disbelief. Hisses, murmurs, questions whispered across rows. Iaria's stylus froze mid-stroke. Always fertile? Her mind reeled at the implications. No cycles, no natural restraint, only a perpetual state of readiness. She had assumed humans were crude, yes, but this was something altogether stranger, something bordering on dangerous. Professor RX let the commotion swell before flicking his tongue once more. Yes, constant. Their hormonal tides are ceaseless, their urges unbound by season or star. What many here might consider a liability has, in fact, fueled their species' expansion. Their aggression, their innovation, their reckless Risk-taking these are bound to the same drive that compels them to seek mates without pause. Ayaria's chest tightened. She looked once more at the lounging human males ahead, their casual swagger suddenly cast in a new, unsettling light. Her logical mind strained to reconcile the revelation with her studies. If true, it explained their relentless energy, their defiance of order, their insatiable reach into the void. And yet, some part of her recoiled. A species ruled so completely by primal forces, how could such creatures ever be trusted? Her stylus trembled in her grip as the weight of the knowledge settled upon her. For the first time, she felt her certainty waver. The foundation of her detached logic cracked open by something raw and disquieting. Humans were not simply primitive newcomers. They were a puzzle dangerous, fascinating, and impossible to ignore. When the lecture finally ended, the amphitheater dissolved into a storm of voices. Students of every form crowded the aisles, debating in rapid bursts, their disbelief and fascination echoing off the vaulted ceilings. Ayaria moved slowly, hugging her datapad to her chest. Her mind replayed the professor's words over and over, each syllable gnawing at her carefully constructed sense of order. Always fertile, always driven. It was absurd, and yet the conviction in Professor RX's rasp left little room for doubt. The corridor beyond the hall was no quieter. Streams of students flowed in either direction, robes rustling, appendages brushing, languages colliding. Ayaria slipped into the current, her thoughts still knotted. She tried to focus on what she knew, the cycles of Azua, the elegant symmetry of biology on her homeworld, the way everything aligned with seasons, tides, and light. There was comfort in the rhythm. But humans had no rhythm, only relentless pulse. A sharp burst of laughter cut through her reverie. Ahead, leaning carelessly against a wall panel, stood the same group of human males who had disturbed her earlier. One flicked a data slate open with a thumb. Another gestured wildly as he recounted some story that had them doubled over. They were so loud, so unrestrained. Passing aliens cast them looks of disapproval, but the humans seemed immune, even emboldened by the dissonance they created. Ayaria quickened her pace, intent on slipping past unnoticed. But as the corridor narrowed, one of them straightened and caught her eye. He was tall, broader than any Azua male she had ever seen, his hair a dark tumble over his forehead, his jaw sharp as carved stone. His gaze pinned her as surely as a gravity lock, and before she could turn away, he pushed off from the wall and stepped directly into her path. "Well, well," he said, voice rich and deep, carrying easily over the din. "If it isn't our diligent note-taker." A grin tugged at his mouth, smug and unshakable. "You were staring holes into me the whole lecture." Heat flared across Ayaria's cheeks, betraying her. She drew herself up, every inch the scholar she aspired to be. "I was not staring," she replied, her tone sharper than she intended. "I was documenting the professor's data." He chuckled, low and amused, as though her words confirmed some private joke. "Sure you were, sweetheart. Scribbling down everything about humans, huh? Guess we're more interesting than you thought." Ayaria's fingers tightened around her datapad. "I'm interested in knowledge, not in you." The statement rang hollow even to her own ears, for his presence pressed in on her senses in ways she could not explain, an intensity that unsettled her carefully arranged composure. He leaned closer, just enough that she caught the faint trace of his scent, warm and unfamiliar, like minerals baked under sunlight. "Name's Clark," he said, grin widening. "And you are?" "Ayaria," she answered before she could stop herself. "Pretty," he said easily, as though it cost him nothing to offer the word. "Fitting, too. Suits you." He tilted his head, studying her with open interest. "You know, you don't have to just read about humans in class. Some lessons are better. Hands-on." Her breath caught. The words were crude, the implication unmistakable. And yet, instead of recoiling as she should have, she felt a tremor run down her spine. Her training screamed at her to disengage, to dismiss him as primitive, dangerous, beneath her notice. But her body, betrayed her with a quickened pulse, with a warmth that spread traitorously through her veins. Clark's grin softened into something more playful, almost challenging. "Think about it, Blue," he said, using the nickname as though it were already theirs to share. "Curiosity's nothing to be ashamed of. Just means you're brave enough to want to know." And with that, he stepped aside, letting the tide of students swallow him back into the crowd. Iaria stood frozen for a moment, heart hammering against her ribs, the world around her a blur of movement and sound. Logic demanded she dismiss him, but his words clung to her like static. Curiosity, he had said. Brave enough to want to know. She pressed her datapad tighter to her chest and forced her feet to move again. But no matter how far she walked, she could not escape the unsettling truth. He was right. Against her will, against her better judgment, she did want to know. The library was one of the few sanctuaries on the Academy grounds that Iaria truly cherished. Its vaulted skylights flooded the marble floors with filtered starlight, and the hush inside was almost reverent, broken only by the occasional whisper of turning pages or the gentle hum of information orbs gliding through the aisles. Here, knowledge ruled above all else. Here, she could forget the reckless voices that haunted the corridors and lose herself in the ordered clarity of data. She settled at a study alcove, her datapad glowing with rows of notes she had already compiled on comparative reproduction cycles. The neat symmetry of her work steadied her, each line of analysis a balm against the disquiet Clark's words had left behind. She told herself she had come to the library to ground her mind, to reaffirm her commitment to science, not to dwell on the smug grin of a human male who delighted in breaking her composure. And yet, when his shadow fell across her table, her breath caught anyway. "Blue," Clark said, his tone as casual as if he'd been expected. He slid into the seat across from her, stretching his long legs beneath the table with unearned familiarity. His uniform tunic clung to his shoulders, his posture radiating ease in a place where most students sat stiff with concentration. He didn't belong here, and he knew it. Iaria stiffened, lowering her stylus with deliberate calm. "This is a study zone," she said. "Not a lounge," he smirked. "Then consider me a guest lecturer. I thought you might want a first-hand source instead of dry text." Her jaw tightened. "I don't require first-hand anything. The professor's data is sufficient." Clark leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and for a moment his voice lost its playfulness. "Data only tells you half the story. The rest you've got to feel." The words sent a pulse of heat through her, and she hated that they did. She glanced around quickly, but the nearby students were engrossed in their own studies, oblivious to the tension crackling across her table. "I don't feel," she said, her voice sharper than intended. "I observe. That is the Azua way. Logic, discipline, precision. Not this. Chaos you revel in." For the first time, Clark's grin softened, the edge of it fading into something gentler. "Chaos isn't always bad," he said quietly. "Sometimes it's where the best discoveries are made." Her pulse betrayed her again, quickening against her will. She wanted to dismiss him, to catalog him as arrogant and crude and nothing more. But beneath his swagger, there was something else, something she hadn't expected. A weight behind his words, a seriousness that flickered through the cracks of his teasing. She forced her gaze back to her datapad. Oh, the symbols blurred. "You speak as though you know better than centuries of science," she muttered. He shrugged. "Maybe I do. Or maybe I just know what it's like to be human. You can't reduce that to charts and cycles." His eyes caught hers, steady and searching. "We're more than hormones, Blue, more than instincts. We choose. That's the difference. The declaration unsettled her more than his flirtations ever had. Choice. The idea that this constant drive was not only biological, but tethered to willpower, to something deeper than chemistry. It cracked open a space in her logic that she couldn't immediately fill. Her stylus slipped from her fingers, clattering softly against the tabletop. Clark leaned back, smirk returning as though he'd scored a point. "Don't worry," he said lightly. "I'll let you get back to your notes. But admit you're curious. And one day, curiosity wins." He stood and sauntered away, leaving her trembling in the quiet alcove. Ayaria stared down at her pad, the screen still glowing with orderly rows of text, yet suddenly meaningless. For the first time, she realized her carefully constructed framework might not be enough. Logic could explain the cycles of stars, the flow of tides, but could it explain the storm now brewing inside her? And worse, was she brave enough to let it? The observatory crowned the highest spire of the academy, its transparent dome arching above like a frozen bubble of glass, holding back the infinite night. Stars spilled across the void in uncountable numbers, bright and sharp against the velvet black. Normally, the space was a haven for quiet stargazing or late-night calculations. But tonight, the air carried a charge something rawer, more immediate than scholarly wonder. Ayaria hesitated at the threshold, her hand hovering over the access panel. She had told herself a dozen times on the way here that she was only coming to prove him wrong, to confront his arrogance, to remind herself of the line between curiosity and folly. And yet her pulse drummed in her throat, each beat whispering the truth. She wanted to see him. She wanted to know what he would say when the world around them fell away and only the stars remained. The doors whispered open. Clark stood near the center of the dome, his tall frame silhouetted against the galaxy's swirl. He wasn't lounging this time, nor laughing, but waiting poised, as though he had known she would come despite every reason not to. When he turned, the low light caught the edges of his face, casting his grin into something softer, something almost welcoming. "I knew you'd show," he said, his voice carrying across the vast chamber. She stepped inside, the doors sealing behind her with a hush. "I don't know why I'm here," she admitted, her words hushed, as though the stars themselves might overhear. Clark crossed the distance in slow strides, each one echoing faintly off the polished floor. "You're here because you want to be," he said, stopping close enough that she could see the warmth in his eyes. "Because all the data in the galaxy won't answer the question you're really asking." Her throat tightened. "And what question is that?" He lifted a hand, not touching, only brushing the air near her cheek, the way one might approach a fragile, untamed animal. "What it feels like," he murmured, "to be close to a human. To step outside the rules you've lived by." Her body betrayed her again, leaning into the space between them, her heart pounding faster than she thought possible. She had spent her life defining herself by discipline, by the distance between herself and chaos. But in this moment, under the endless sweep of stars, she felt the edges of that distance blur. "You reduce everything to feelings," she whispered, more accusation than question. "And you reduce everything to numbers," he countered gently. "Maybe we're both wrong." The silence stretched, filled only by the thrum of her pulse and the hush of air recyclers. Then his hand found her cheek, warm and steady, and her breath caught as though the dome itself had shifted. When his lips met hers, the world didn't end as she feared, it expanded, stars bursting brighter in her vision, her carefully arranged order shattering into something uncharted and terrifyingly alive. She had told herself she would resist, but the truth spilled through every nerve. She didn't want to. Her hands rose, clutching at his tunic, grounding herself in the heat of him, as though he were the only constant in a spinning universe. His kiss was not just hunger, it carried weight, intent, something deeper than the bravado he wore in the halls. When at last they broke apart, she was trembling, her breath ragged. Clark's grin was gone, replaced by something softer, more vulnerable. "See?" he whispered. "Some lessons you can't learn from a lecture." Iaria pressed her hand to her chest, as if to steady the wild rhythm inside. For the first time, she felt the fracture between logic and instinct not as weakness, but as possibility. The stars overhead stretched vast and endless, but none seemed as daunting or as exhilarating as the path she had just set foot upon. Whispers followed her through the halls in the days that came after. At first, Iaria thought it was her own guilt projecting shadows onto the glances of her peers, but soon she realized the rumors had taken root. A few too many stolen looks across lecture halls, too many moments where Clark's laughter seemed aimed only at her. The Academy's students, ever hungry for gossip, wove their own tales of the blue scholar and the Terran brute stories. That spread faster than any data packet. She buried herself in her studies, clinging to routine like a lifeline. The library became both refuge and prison, her notes multiplying in desperate lines of script. She told herself that discipline would cleanse the fire he had lit in her blood, that she could smother it beneath analysis and charts. But every word she wrote blurred with memories, the press of his hand against her cheek, the weight of his kiss under the stars, the warmth that lingered long after she returned to her dorm. It should have been simple. Humans were anomalies, reckless creatures whose biology defied the logic of more ordered species. She was Azua, daughter of symmetry, raised on cycles as precise as the turning of planets. Yet even as she reminded herself of this, she could not unhear Professor RX's words. Fertile, always, driven always. Was that what she felt radiating from Clark whenever he caught her gaze across a crowded hall? An unrelenting tide, impossible to resist? One afternoon, in the quiet between seminars, she lingered in a sunlit courtyard, her datapad resting forgotten in her lap. Students crossed in clusters, their robes trailing like banners in the warm air. She sat alone on the stone bench, but not unnoticed. Two insectoid scholars clicked their mandibles in hushed exchange as they passed. A pair of avian students ruffled their feathers, eyes flicking toward her before darting away. Even among such diversity, she felt suddenly isolated, as though every whisper in the courtyard carried her name. The ache in her chest deepened when she spotted him, Clark, striding through the archway with his usual careless confidence. He drew eyes wherever he went, but it was the way his gaze locked instantly on her that made her heart stumble. She should have looked away, should have pretended not to notice. Instead, she sat frozen as he crossed the courtyard, his grin faint but unmistakable. He stopped a few paces from her bench, hands shoved casually into his pockets. "You look like you're carrying the whole galaxy on your shoulders, Blue." Her throat tightened. "People are talking," she managed, her voice low. "Let them," he said, shrugging as though it meant nothing. "They don't matter. They do to me." Her words came sharper than intended, laced with the fear she hadn't dared admit until now. "My reputation, my work, it could all unravel." For a moment, the cocky light in his eyes softened. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Then tell me to stay away, and I will." The air between them crackled, her heart racing so fast it hurt. She wanted to say it, to end this before the fire consumed everything she had built. But the words tangled in her throat, held hostage by the memory of his warmth, and the truth she could no longer deny. She didn't want him gone. "I can't," she whispered finally, the confession trembling in the space between them. Clark's grin returned, gentler this time. "Good, because neither can I." As he turned and walked away, leaving her trembling on the bench, Iaria pressed a hand to her chest. Shame and exhilaration warred inside her, logic and instinct clashing louder than ever. She knew she was standing on a precipice, that one more step forward would take her past the point of no return. And yet, even surrounded by whispers and doubt. She felt a truth settling into her bones. The danger wasn't just that she might fall. It was that she wanted to. The laboratory lights glowed sterile white, reflecting off steel counters and glass specimen tanks. It should have been a place of clarity, a fortress of logic where cells and cycles could be dissected, catalogued, understood. Yet Ayaria's hands trembled faintly as she adjusted the calibration of her scanner. She had chosen this lab session as a distraction, a way to anchor herself back in the rhythms of her people. Instead, she found her thoughts drifting again and again to the human who had unsettled her more than any scientific anomaly ever. The door hissed open, and her resolve faltered. Clark entered with the easy stride of someone who had never once questioned his place in a room. He carried no datapad, no instruments, only that insufferable confidence that seemed to draw stares, whether he wanted it to or not. A few students muttered disapproval under their breath, but he ignored them, his gaze finding her instantly across the room. Ayaria ducked her head, focusing on the specimen tank before her, a harmless amphibian from the oceans of Ventra 4. Its predictable pulse steadied her, cycles as reliable as tides. But then Clark was at her side, leaning just close enough that she felt the heat radiating from him. "You've been avoiding me, Blue," he murmured. Her stylus slipped, nearly scratching the datapad. "I have been studying," she said, forcing her voice into neutrality. Clark smirked. "Studying humans too, I bet." Ayaria's resolve cracked. She turned to face him fully, violet eyes flashing. "Yes," she said, surprising herself with the honesty of it. "I want to understand. Your kind defy every principle of biology I've been taught. Always fertile, always driven. It makes no sense. How do you not collapse under the weight of it? How do you live?" For once, his grin faltered. He studied her, then set his hands on the counter, palms open, as if showing he had nothing to hide. "It's true we're wired hot, always ready. But it's not just instinct that runs us, Blue. It's choice. Desire, yeah, but directed. We decide who matters. We decide when to act. That's what makes us human." The words lodged in her like hooks. She had expected arrogance, another jest, to make her blush. Instead, she saw something raw flicker in his eyes, an honesty she hadn't been prepared for. "You choose?" she asked softly. "Every time," Clark said, his voice low but steady. "You think it's biology pulling me toward you? Maybe it started that way. But I'm here now because I want to be. Because you matter." Her breath caught, and for a moment, the lab around them dissolved. No glass, no steel, no rows of specimens, only him, and the terrifying sincerity in his gaze. Her entire life, she had believed attraction to be mechanical, the byproduct of cycles and chemical tides. Yet here was a human, telling her it was more something deliberate, something deeper. Her voice trembled. "Clark, this can't work. Our species, our worlds, none of them will accept it." He leaned closer, his words a whisper meant only for her. "Then let them talk. Let them stare. I'm not asking the galaxy for permission. Just you." The edges of her discipline frayed. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine what it would mean to choose him in return, not as an experiment, not as a lapse in logic, but as a decision of her own. The thought left her trembling, equal parts terror and exhilaration. Before she could reply, the lab instructor called for attention, breaking the spell. Students shuffled back to their work, murmuring about specimens and data logs. Ayaria turned back to her tank, but her hands no longer moved with certainty. Her world of order had cracked open, and through the fissure something wild and unstoppable was pouring in. Clark had offered her a choice, and she could no longer pretend she didn't want to take it. The Academy's grand convocation chamber shimmered with ceremony. Transparent banners hung like streams of light, each bearing the crest of a different world. The air was alive with expectation, the low hum of hundreds of voices rising and falling in the vaulted dome. This was no ordinary gathering today. Professor RX and the xenobiology faculty would present their newest findings, drawn from months of intensive research into one of the galaxy's most controversial arrivals, the humans of Earth. Iaria sat stiffly among the delegates of Azua, her silver robes immaculate, the datapad clutched so tightly that her knuckles had gone pale. The last few weeks had been a blur of whispers, stolen moments, and questions that had no neat answers. Logic still pulled at her, reminding her of who she was supposed to be, disciplined, precise, untouchable. And yet she felt Clark's presence even before she saw him enter the chamber. His stride was unhurried, his shoulders squared as though the whole galaxy's eyes couldn't unsettle him. When he passed her row, his gaze flicked toward her for the briefest heartbeat, steady, grounding, impossibly sure, and her heart betrayed her with a quickened rhythm. Professor RX coiled to the center dais, his bronze scales gleaming under the chamber's lights. He spread his clawed hands for silence, his forked tongue flickering. "Esteemed students and scholars," he began, his rasp carrying with ceremonial gravity, "today we share revelations that may reshape our understanding of human biology, and perhaps our future." The holoprojectors bloomed, filling the chamber with rotating models of DNA strands, cell structures, hormonal feedback loops. Iaria leaned forward instinctively, her scholar's heart drawn to the details. RX's voice wove through the data. "You have heard of human fertility, unceasing, untethered to season or star. What was once dismissed as aberration, we now confirm as fact." Gasps rippled through the chamber, though Iaria barely breathed. Hearing the professor state it with such certainty sent a fresh shiver down her spine. "But there is more," RX continued, his eyes narrowing. The projection shifted, displaying double helixes entwining, aligning. In controlled simulations, human genetic markers show unprecedented adaptability. Preliminary models predict interbreeding compatibility with several species previously thought genetically isolated, including. He paused for effect, his tongue tasting the air. The Azua, the chamber erupted. Shouts, hisses, incredulous laughter. Students turned toward Iaria, some with open curiosity, others with scandalized disdain. Her throat closed as if the air had turned too thin to breathe. Professor RX let the storm rage before raising a clawed hand. If true, this adaptability may prove both peril and promise. Humanity's relentless drive could forge bridges where none existed, or it could sow chaos across every star system. Iaria hardly heard the rest. Her mind reeled, the professor's words spinning with Clark's voice in the lab. "We choose. You matter." Was she no longer simply a student studying an anomaly? Was she, without realizing, standing at the very frontier of this revelation? When the convocation ended in a cacophony of debate, she rose on unsteady legs. Clark was there, waiting by the columned archway, his grin subdued, eyes searching hers. For once he said nothing, only offered the faintest tilt of his head, as if asking a question without words. Iaria's chest tightened. She thought of her people's cycles, their sacred order. She thought of the galaxy's whispers, of reputations and rules. And then she thought of him reckless, infuriating, but also honest, unflinching, and alive in a way that stirred something she had never known inside herself. She stepped toward him. Gasps followed her, some scandalized, some awed, but she barely heard them. When she reached his side, Clark's hand brushed hers in the smallest of touches, enough to ground her, to claim nothing more than presence. In that moment, under the weight of every watching eye, Iaria understood the true revelation. Humans were not dangerous because they defied cycles. They were dangerous because they offered choice, because they awakened something in others that could not be charted or controlled. And she had chosen Dot as the chamber filled with clamor and speculation. Ayaria walked beside Clark into the uncertain light of the future, her heart trembling with fear and exhilaration. Whatever consequences lay ahead, she knew one thing with certainty. Nothing in the galaxy would ever be the same again.